The wind did not merely blow, it screamed through the rusted iron skeleton of the buried train car like a chorus of the damned. Sarah pressed her back against the decaying velvet of the overturned parlor seat, her breath pluming in the pitch-black, freezing air. Her hands, numb and entirely devoid of feeling, were clamped around the cold walnut stock of a Winchester rifle she had scavenged from the wreckage. She was 24 years old, 6 months pregnant, and shivering so violently that her teeth clattered like shattered porcelain. Beneath the heavy frozen wool of her skirts, she felt the baby turn, a tiny, defiant flutter of life against the crushing, oppressive weight of the ice. But it was not the lethal cold that had forced her to raise the heavy barrel of the rifle toward the frosted, shattered window. It was the sound, a rhythmic, deliberate crunch. Boots compressing the fresh snow. They were out there, the men who had left her to die. As you listen to the howling wind rattle the icy iron of this forgotten carriage, take a brief moment to tell us in the comments below which city you are watching from tonight. And do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. For the story you are about to hear is a testament to the fact that hell hath no fury like a mother pushed to the edge of the abyss. Only 3 days prior, the world had been warm. Thomas had been alive. Thomas, with his calloused hands that smelled of coal dust and pine, with his gentle voice that spoke of a future far away from the iron grip of the Pacific Western Railroad Company. They had told her it was a tragic accident, a derailment near the canyon ridge, they said, a terrible twist of fate that claimed her husband's life. But Sarah had seen the way the company men avoided her eyes when they brought back his personal effects. She had seen the untouched clasp of his pocket watch, the absence of his silver wedding band. And then, before the earth on his grave had even begun to settle, the storm arrived. Not just the meteorological nightmare that would blanket the territory in 3 feet of snow, but a storm dressed in a tailored wool suit and a silk cravat. Sterling, the magnate. A man whose wealth was built on the broken backs of laborers and the silent tears of their widows. He had arrived at her modest wooden home on the edge of town, flanked by the local sheriff, a man whose badge was merely a shiny accessory bought and paid for by railroad money. Sterling had not even removed his hat when he stepped into her parlor. He had produced a ledger, its pages pristine, pointing a gloved finger at a column of forged signatures. He claimed Thomas had embezzled company funds, that the house, the land, the very clothes in her wardrobe were forfeit to settle the debt. Sarah had protested, her voice cracking with fresh grief, pleading for time, pleading for the sake of the child growing in her womb. But Sterling had merely looked at her stomach with eyes as dead and flat as tarnished pennies. The sheriff had dragged her out by the arm, her boots scraping against the floorboards she had scrubbed with her own hands, throwing her out onto the porch just as the first brutal flakes of the blizzard began to fall. The eviction was an execution without a firing squad. As the heavy wooden door of her home slammed shut, locking her out in the freezing dusk, Sarah had stumbled down the steps. She walked toward the town, the wind immediately biting through her thin morning dress. But fear is a contagious disease, and Sterling had infected the entire town. As she dragged her boots through the rapidly accumulating snow, knocking on heavy oak doors, she heard the slide of deadbolts. She saw curtains twitch and then close tightly. The baker, the blacksmith, the seamstress, people she had shared meals with, people Thomas had helped, all turned their backs, terrified of the magnate's wrath. The cold began to seep into her bones, a deep, agonizing ache that started in her extremities and crawled toward her heart. The snow fell thicker, faster, a blinding white wall that erased the horizon, erased the road, erased all hope. She wandered for what felt like hours, a ghost adrift in a white purgatory. Her eyelashes froze together. Every breath was a shard of glass drawn into her burning lungs. She wrapped her arms around her swelling belly, whispering desperate prayers into the howling wind, promising the unborn child that she would not stop. She would not sit down. She would not surrender to the seductive, sleepy warmth that precedes freezing to death. Her legs gave way just as she struck something hard, something unyielding and metallic hidden beneath a massive snowdrift. Her torn, bleeding fingers frantically clawed at the snow, revealing a heavy iron door, a frosted glass window, the ornate gold leaf lettering of a private Pullman car. It was a phantom train, derailed and abandoned deep in the ravine years ago, swallowed by the wilderness and forgotten by time. With the last ounce of her failing strength, Sarah pried the heavy door open, tumbling into the pitch-black interior as the wind screamed in protest. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of old leather, rotting velvet, and damp wood. But it was out of the wind. She lay on the floor for a long, agonizing moment, the silence of the enclosed space ringing in her ears. But the cold was still lethal. If she did not find warmth, she and the baby would perish before dawn. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, moonlight filtering through the snow-caked windows, illuminating the decayed opulence of the car. Crystal sconces hung precariously from the ceiling. Heavy mahogany chairs bolted to the floor were covered in dust and frost. She needed fire. Her hands, stiff as claws, fumbled through her pockets, finding the single box of matches she had grabbed before being thrown out. But matches were useless without fuel. Driven by a primal maternal instinct that overrode her physical exhaustion, Sarah found a heavy iron fireplace poker resting in the corner. She raised it with trembling arms and brought it down on a mahogany side table. The wood splintered with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. She struck again and again, tearing the luxury to pieces, panting, sweating despite the freezing temperature. She piled the splintered wood into the small, ornate cast-iron stove at the end of the car, feeding it with torn pages from an old magazine she found wedged between the seats. When the match flared, casting a desperate yellow glow on her pale face, she watched the flame catch the paper, then the dry, aged wood. The fire roared to life. The warmth was a physical salvation, a tender embrace that made her weep in sheer relief. As the temperature in the car slowly rose, the frost on the windows melting into tears of water, Sarah felt the baby kick again, stronger this time. They were alive, but as she sat on the floor, feeding the fire, her eyes caught something unusual in the flickering light. Where she had dragged the broken table, a section of the ornate hardwood floor seemed slightly depressed. There was a faint hollow sound when she tapped it with the poker. The instinct of survival shifted into a burning, insatiable curiosity. She wedged the iron tip of the poker into the crack between the floorboards and pushed with all her might. With a groan of protesting nails, the board popped up, revealing a dark, recessed compartment beneath the floor. Sarah reached inside. Her fingers brushed against heavy canvas bags and a thick, leather-bound book. She dragged them out into the firelight. When she untied the canvas bag, the fire reflected off cold, heavy bars of solid gold, stamped with government seals. It was a fortune, a king's ransom buried in a frozen grave. But it was the book that made her heart stop. She opened the heavy leather cover, her eyes scanning the meticulous handwriting. It was a shadow ledger. Dates, routes, names, bribes paid to politicians, sheriffs, and judges. And there, near the bottom of the most recent page, was the name of the car's owner. Arthur Sterling, the magnate, the man who had banished her to die. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, reading the dark history of the railroad's expansion, The blood spilled for every mile of track. And then she saw it. An entry dated exactly 1 week ago. Thomas's name. Beside it, a single chilling word. Liquidated. The reason? Thomas had been a line inspector. He had found this car. He had found the gold sterling had been siphoning from federal transports and hiding off the main grid. Thomas had found it, and he had been murdered for it. The derailment was a lie. Her husband had been executed to protect a criminal empire. The grief that had paralyzed her heart shattered, replaced by a cold, luminous rage. It was a rage so absolute, so crystalline, that it completely eradicated her fear. Sterling had thrown her into the blizzard, assuming she was nothing but a fragile, weeping widow. He assumed the cold would silence her, just as his assassins had silenced Thomas. He had severely underestimated the destructive power of a mother with nothing left to lose. She was no longer a victim waiting to freeze. She was the ghost of his sins, armed with the very secrets he had killed to protect. But the fire that saved her life had also betrayed her presence. The iron smokestack on the roof of the buried car had pushed a thin, gray ribbon of smoke into the clear, freezing night sky, and Sterling's men, dispatched to patrol the perimeter of the town and ensure the widow had succumbed to the elements, had seen it. Sarah heard them before she saw them. The crunch of boots. The low, muffled voices of men accustomed to committing violence in the dark. She quickly extinguished the fire with a handful of snow scooped from the broken window, plunging the car back into freezing darkness. She secured the ledger inside her heavy coat, wrapping it tightly against her chest, right above her unborn child. She picked up the Winchester rifle she had found in the car's gun rack, checking the mechanism. The cold metal bit into her palms, but her hands no longer shook. "Check the wreckage," a gruff voice commanded outside. "Boss wants to make sure she's a popsicle." Sarah did not hide. She did not cower. She moved with a silent, deadly grace to the shattered window. Through the frosted glass, she saw 3 dark silhouettes moving across the blinding white snow, holding lanterns that cast eerie, long shadows. She rested the heavy barrel of the rifle on the window frame, taking aim. She did not want to kill them. She needed to send a message, and she needed time to escape. She exhaled, steadying her breathing, aligning the sights with the lantern held by the lead man. She pulled the trigger. The roar of the Winchester in the confined space of the train car was deafening, a clap of thunder that shattered the icy silence of the ravine. The bullet obliterated the lantern in the man's hand, showering him with sparks and burning oil. He screamed, dropping into the snow, thrashing wildly. The other 2 men panicked, firing their revolvers blindly into the darkness, the bullets pinging uselessly against the heavy iron armor of the Pullman car. Sarah pumped the lever, the smooth mechanical clack cutting through the chaos, and fired again, this time putting a bullet into the snow inches from the second man's boots. "She's armed! Fall back!" one of them yelled, terror lacing his voice. They had expected a frozen corpse, not a fortified sniper. They scrambled up the snowy embankment, slipping and cursing, retreating into the blizzard to fetch reinforcements. Sarah knew she had only hours. She gathered the ledger, took a heavy wool blanket from the car, and stepped back out into the freezing night. She did not head back to the town. The town belonged to Sterling. She headed north, into the teeth of the wilderness, toward the county line, toward a jurisdiction where Sterling's gold could not buy the law. The journey was an agonizing blur of physical torture. Every step through the knee-deep snow was a battle against her own failing muscles. The weight of the baby pulled at her lower back, a constant painful reminder of what she was fighting for. She ate handfuls of snow to stay hydrated, her mind hallucinating from exhaustion, seeing Thomas walking ahead of her, urging her on. When she finally collapsed onto the wooden porch of the federal marshal's outpost, 30 miles from her home, the sun was rising, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the ice. The marshal, an older, scarred man with eyes that had seen decades of frontier justice, opened the door. Sarah did not speak. She simply unbuttoned her coat and handed him the frozen, blood-stained leather ledger. 3 months later, the cold had receded, but the chill in the federal courthouse in the capital was palpable. The courtroom was a cavern of polished mahogany, brass fixtures, and vaulted ceilings that echoed with the murmurs of reporters, federal agents, and curious citizens. The air smelled of pipe tobacco, floor wax, and nervous sweat. At the defense table sat Arthur Sterling, no longer looking like the untouchable magnate of the winter. He looked pale, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame, his eyes darting frantically around the room. Beside him was his defense attorney, Mr. Vance, a slick, serpentine man imported from the East Coast, famous for tearing witnesses apart with condescending theatricality. Sarah sat at the prosecutor's table. She was heavily pregnant now, her black mourning dress impeccably clean, her posture ramrod straight. She did not look at Sterling. She looked only at the judge, a stern federal appointee who harbored no love for corrupt railroad barons. When Sarah was called to the stand, a hush fell over the gallery. She walked slowly, supporting her back, and took her seat. Mr. Vance approached the podium, a patronizing smile plastered across his face. He adjusted his lapels, leaning in as if speaking to a confused child. "Mrs. Sarah," Vance began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "we are all deeply, profoundly sorry for your loss. The tragic accident that claimed your husband was a blow to the entire community. But we must be honest with ourselves here today. You have endured a terrible trauma, a trauma compounded by your delicate condition. Is it not possible, Mrs. Sarah, that in your overwhelming grief, your mind sought to find a villain where there was only an unfortunate twist of fate? Is it not possible that this grand conspiracy you speak of is simply the desperate hallucination of a grieving, hysterical widow who wandered too long in the cold?" Vance turned to the jury, spreading his hands. "Gentlemen, we have a woman who was found half frozen, raving about secret compartments and murdered husbands. The ledger she presents is entirely circumstantial. A forgery, perhaps, created by a mind broken by sorrow." Sarah did not flinch. She did not cry. Her eyes, hardened by the ice and fueled by the fire of the train car, locked onto Vance with a gaze so piercing the lawyer actually took a half-step back. "Mr. Vance," Sarah said, her voice clear, steady, and echoing off the high ceilings. Grief did not forge the handwriting in that ledger. Hysteria did not mint the federal gold buried beneath the floorboards of your client's hidden luxury car. And a hallucination did not fire a rifle at me in the middle of a blizzard when your client's men came to ensure I had frozen to death." Vance scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Wild accusations. You claim my client ordered your husband's death, yet you have no witnesses. You have only numbers in a book that anyone could have written." "I have the numbers," Sarah replied coolly, "and I have the specific federal serial codes of the gold bars. I also have the date, time, and exact location of every bribe your client paid to the sheriff of our town, matching perfectly with the sheriff's bank deposits in the neighboring state. Are you suggesting my hysteria is capable of cross-referencing interstate banking records?" A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. Vance flushed red, his composure slipping. "You are not a financial expert. You are a pregnant housewife. You cannot possibly understand the complexities of corporate logistics." "I understand addition and subtraction, Mr. Vance," Sarah shot back, her voice rising in power, commanding the entire room. "I understand that when a company reports a loss of federal freight on the same day, my husband notes a discrepancy in the cargo manifests, and 3 days later my husband is found dead under a collapsed trestle. The sum total is murder." "Turn to page 42 of the ledger, Mr. Vance." Vance hesitated, looking back at Sterling, who was now sweating profusely. "Turn to page 42, Sarah demanded, her voice ringing like a bell. The prosecutor handed the open ledger to the jury foreman. "On that page," Sarah continued, her eyes never leaving Sterling's terrified face, "you will find the authorization for the payment of $200 to a foreman named Elias Thorne. The payment was categorized as demolition. Elias Thorne was the man in charge of inspecting the canyon trestle the day my husband's train went off the tracks." At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The federal marshal walked in, escorting a trembling, haggard man in a dirty suit. It was Elias Thorne. He had been found hiding in a brothel 2 states over, terrified that Sterling was tying up loose ends. The color completely drained from Sterling's face. He collapsed back into his chair, a defeated, broken man. The cross-examination disintegrated. Vance had no defense against the meticulous, undeniable paper trail, combined with the sudden appearance of the bribed foreman. Sarah sat on the stand for 4 agonizingly long hours, dissecting the magnate's empire piece by piece. She answered every patronizing question with a scalpel-like precision, dismantling Vance's arrogant bluster until the lawyer was left stuttering and looking desperately at the judge. She proved that the debts used to evict her were entirely fabricated, a desperate attempt by Sterling to eliminate the widow of the man he had murdered, ensuring no one would come looking for answers. When the jury returned, they did not even sit down. The foreman stood tall, his voice echoing in the silent room. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy, embezzlement, fraud, and the first-degree murder of Thomas Arthur Sterling, the man who had owned towns, politicians, and the very rails that crossed the territory, was sentenced to spend the remainder of his natural life in a federal penitentiary, his assets seized, his empire dissolved. The sheriff was arrested the following morning. Before striking his gavel, the federal judge looked down at Sarah. "Mrs. Sarah," he said, his voice softening, "the court recognizes that the property seized from you was taken under fraudulent and malicious pretenses. Furthermore, a significant portion of the recovered company assets, legitimately owed to the workers who were defrauded and killed, requires a steward. By order of this federal court, the land, the home, and the recovered back wages are hereby transferred to your name." Months later, the brutal winter was nothing but a memory. The ice had melted, transforming the barren white valleys into lush, vibrant seas of green grass and wildflowers. The air was warm, smelling of damp earth and blooming dogwood. Sarah sat on the porch of a beautifully constructed new homestead. In her arms, she held her newborn son, a healthy, quiet boy with his father's eyes. The homestead was not built in the town that had turned its back on her. It was built at the edge of the ravine. Down below, no longer buried in the snow, rested the Pullman train car. It had been pulled from the ditch, restored, and placed on a permanent stone foundation. But it was no longer a symbol of corruption and greed. It was an office. Above the door hung a freshly painted wooden sign. Sarah had not simply taken her wealth and vanished into a life of quiet luxury. She knew intimately the pain of the powerless. She knew how easily the gears of industry could grind a family to dust. Using the recovered funds and her new legal standing, she had founded a massive cooperative and legal defense fund for the families of railway workers. widows who were threatened with eviction, workers who were maimed on the tracks and denied compensation, families crushed by the monopolistic cruelty of the railroad. They all found their way to Sarah's door. She provided housing, legal representation, and a community that could never again be intimidated by men in expensive suits. The train car that was supposed to be her frozen tomb had become a fortress of protection for the vulnerable. As she rocked her son, looking out over the sprawling green valley, Sarah understood a profound, unyielding truth about the world. The system was meticulously designed to make the vulnerable disappear. It was built by men who believed that power belonged only to those who held the gold and wrote the laws. They relied on the cold, the literal cold of a winter storm, and the metaphorical cold of a society that looks away from suffering to silently erase their mistakes. They thought that a pregnant widow, stripped of her home and her husband, would simply lie down in the snow and freeze, accepting her fate as a tragic inevitability. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the human spirit. They had forgotten that beneath the softest velvet and the most delicate exterior, there lies a primal, indestructible core. When you strip a person of everything, when you push them into the absolute dark and demand that they die quietly, you do not always break them. Sometimes you forge them. Sarah had been thrown into the abyss, but she had refused to let the ice claim her blood. She had taken the very tools of her destruction, the hidden car, the stolen gold, the secret ledger, and used them to burn an empire to the ground. She had proven that true strength does not roar from a boardroom. It survives in the dark, it endures the freezing wind, and it waits for the perfect moment to strike. If this story of resilience, survival, and ultimate justice stirred something within you, if you believe that no empire of corruption can stand against the fierce, unyielding will of a mother protecting her own, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Join us as we continue to unearth the incredible, hidden stories of those who defied the odds and changed the history of the West. Until next time, stay strong, stay vigilant, and never let the cold put out your fire.